How do you see independent financial advisors, or really the financial world, if you will, shifting to, in fact, help achieve the MDGs, or moving on to the SDGs, because as you know, we have less than 1,000 days left. So how can the financial world, the people involved, help really to achieve these goals?
Well, they could help first by stopping harming, right? So what's mostly going on is a lot of harm from the financial community. If you wanted to look at what has required the Millennium Goals, in large part, it would have been the impoverishment of Africa and Latin America, and that was largely finance driven. So, if we could rewind history, it would be not to do the things we did, and we are redoing in Europe right now. All right, so we're getting people locked into debts that they can never repay. And when I say people, I mean governments with sovereign debt. And once they're locked into that disaster, they can't have any growth. Well, that was the experience in Africa. That was the experience in Latin America until about 15 years ago. So going forward, we should stop doing that stupid stuff, which we're doing right now all through Europe with austerity. And the second thing that we ought to do is, it sounds a little arcane, but it's the Doha round of trade agreements. So the Doha round of trade agreements said, look, there are enormous numbers of restrictions in the wealthiest nations on what goods they'll import from poorer nations. And this has the effect of producing a significant subsidy to the rich nation suppliers, but it wipes out the poor nation suppliers in terms of their ability to compete. So, we've had a gut check for now, it's like 8 years that Doha's been twisting slowly in the wind, and the U.S. and the EU take turns blaming each other, but it's, of course, really a story of the two groups combined in their interaction. So the best single thing financial people could do would be to lobby with their governments to adopt the Doha round.
And then kind of a recap. So we were here just last year, and not much has changed in the financial climate, let's say. The U.S., of course, we've seen an improvement in jobs. We're seeing an improvement, let's say, a steady growth, some analysts have said, for the U.S. But now we're also seeing, in terms of the EU, Cyprus is becoming an issue too. So there's this little bit of up, but then a little bit of, kind of the regression as well. In your expertise, what are you seeing happening in terms of just the last year or so? Are there any market improvements? Are we out of the gray, if you will, or the trouble zone? Or do you see things kind of tapering back soon, because that's what we're hearing as well?
No, I wouldn't agree with your overall summary. So the U.S. we would have described as a steady but modest recovery until about 6 months ago. And the big news in the United States is that in mid-2011, the President of the United States, Obama, tried to cut what he calls a grand bargain. People like me call it the grand betrayal, that would have inflicted European-style austerity. And if he had succeeded, unemployment would have risen in the election year of 2012 in the United States well over 10%, and we would be referring to him as former President Obama right now. Since that time, they've cut 5 deals, each of which has imposed austerity. So in the United States, what we're seeing is a modest recovery that's being strangled, and the U.S. has been the engine in terms of the EU of growth, right? So you have simultaneously Europe inflicting austerity on itself, but praying that the United States would do the opposite. And now we're headed in their direction. If you look at Europe, this is no longer the second recession. It's obscene, in fact. If you go on to the European Commission website, you'll see their official description is that this is a mild recession. Now that's so disingenuous as to be sad. If you look at places like Spain and Italy, and of course Greece, you are not looking at mild recession. You are not looking at return of the Great Recession. You are talking about unemployment levels that are more severe than most years during the Great Depression. And you're looking at youth unemployment levels that have never been seen in recorded time in Europe. So this is the Uber Depression, right? It is far worse than the Great Depression in a number of countries. Even in a place like France, the unemployment rate now is greater than the average unemployment rate in 1930 to 1938, to give you a comparison. And the numbers as we're speaking, just coming out in terms of the key indices of employers in Europe, they are down again. They are trending down, and they are below the supposed magic 50 that indicates that they're headed towards recession again. So right now, the recession is actually deepening, and since we last talked a year ago, it is considerably deeper in a number of European countries. And you have, in particular, the Germans, but not only the Germans, saying there is no alternative. We must continue this disaster. So what you're going to see very quickly, if we do this interview again a year from now, is the political changes that are going to come from this. You've already seen in France the election of Hollande, but you're going to see as soon as they go up for election, the Spanish ruling party will be, they won't simply lose, they'll be crushed in the polls. You've seen in Italy the inability to even form a government. Portugal. Well, they kept what? Right? They kept in a world of bizarre policies where austerity is still the default. And in all of these countries, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in Greece, in Ireland, now when your kid graduates from university, he or she checks to make sure that their passport is valid and is often emigrating. And so we're taking Europe's best and brightest, and not necessarily leaving Europe. Many of them go elsewhere in Europe, but they're certainly leaving their home countries. And this is not shooting yourself in the foot. You're aiming considerably farther up your body into your main torso when you do these kinds of things. So no, it is shocking how much things have deteriorated in Europe since we talked last year. There seems to be no ability to learn from mistakes.
So then I have to pose the big question here. Is reform possible in this sort of regression that I'm hearing, if not more than a regression financially in the global climate of the world? But if reform is possible, what do these countries have to do, and how could it happen?
So reform is definitely possible. If you look at the antecedent of austerity here in Europe, of course, it's the Washington Consensus. And the test bed for the Washington Consensus was Latin America. And so if you look around Latin America, you'll see it varies by particular election, but about 8 to 10 Latin American leaders will be elected on a platform of elect me and I will prevent austerity. That insanity. You're going to see the same thing in Europe. Now, France is obviously mixed. Hollande is officially opposed to austerity, but officially adopting austerity simultaneously and saying we need an alternative. So he is all things to all people on this time. But you're going to get people that come and are elected on an absolute elect me and I will refuse to go this route. The question is, in Europe, whether the European Central Bank will act enough like a true central bank and make the euro enough like a real sovereign currency that it's going to actually save the euro. Because right now, it's a completely bastardized regime in which they say it's not really a sovereign currency, and they just use words to say, well, we're not going to let anyone fail. And you can see in terms of the markets that that brought down risk premia on the periphery by 300 to 400 basis points, just that sort of promise. So they could have always done that, right? They could have done that from the beginning, and we would have never had that aspect of the sovereign debt crisis. But in America, we call about the letting it twist slowly in the wind. And that's what the European specialty has been. Cyprus, wait, let it become a crisis, come up with a stupid plan that ultimately gets 0 affirmative votes in the Cypriot legislature, parliament, and then come up with a real plan that is also, and a week after they create the supposed structure for how they're going to do liquidations, and they promise that anyone within the European insurance limit, 100,000 euros, will not suffer any losses. They go to Cyprus and they try to impose losses on people within the insurance limit. Now, this is to save 20 million euros. I mean, that's nothing you're putting at risk. Why would anyone in Italy or Spain or Portugal keep their money in a bank of those nations? Why wouldn't they put it in a bank where you really will be protected by deposit insurance? And you don't want to create, as a former financial regulator, that's the last thing in the world Europe should have wanted to create, is an incentive to have these kind of slow runs. And slow doesn't mean non-dangerous. You know, you can get literally tens of billions of euros rolling out of a large bank over a period of 6 to 9 months in something like this. And if that begins to happen, then they're going to be right back in the soup in terms of the latest crisis. And Europe now brings a crisis every 6 weeks or so, right? And in which there's always terrible publicity. And
So I don't hear the possibility of reform.
No, the possibility
did I miss it?
Well, the possibility of reform is that you elect enough people and they say hell no to the Germans, right? So right now it's as if Germany won World War II. As I recall, it went the other direction. But Germany has now gotten hegemonic power in the EU. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, always it was Germany wasn't fully normalized and it had to be with its partner France and such. That fiction has now been completely blown away. And in Germany, the counter pressure is to be even more extreme in many ways, right? So the new party they're trying to form is even more reactionary. And then you have the United Kingdom, which actually has a sovereign currency and has no excuse for being back in recession, right? This was not inflicted by Merkel, which has decided to strangle its own economy and such. And even this is the world, the IMF of all entities, the mother and father of austerity, is going throughout Europe and to England and saying, don't do this. We've actually done the research, God forbid, and austerity causes vastly more damage than we thought, and stimulus does much more good than we thought, and so stop doing this. But of course the IMF doesn't even listen to itself in the case of Cyprus, so why should anyone else listen to them? It's this incoherence of policy that is strange. But yes, you can get to a tipping point where enough people get elected opposing austerity that Germany discovers what happens when people say no. Because as we all know, the European governance mechanism didn't get fixed, which means that even a single country can actually bring European operations to a grinding halt by saying no to a whole bunch of things, much less if it were 8 countries where the leaders were elected on the basis of opposing austerity. And for all of Merkel's toughness, she's actually been flexible. You can see she's changed. We would say, tacked like a sailboat, as opposed to following a straight line course, depending on the political realities. So you need someone to actually stand up to her. And the fact that no European leader has ever really been willing to stand up to Merkel is astonishing thing in terms of governance. We're like, what's wrong with all the rest of Europe?